Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I want to look at Existence and Being by Martin Heidegger. This is a collection of 4 of his essays, and it's not just a collection of his essays, but it's also an extended essay, which is presented as the introduction, but it really takes up more than half of the book, which is an extended explanation of Martin Heidegger. And the introduction talks a lot about being and time. And one of the reasons that it does that is that this book is the first English translation of Martin Heidegger that there was. It was published in 1949, before the English translation of Being and Time. So this is the English-speaking world's first encounter with Martin Heidegger. And Being in Time is such an important part of Heidegger's work that a good portion of the extended introduction is an examination of Being in Time. And it walks through Being in Time in quite some detail. And then it also, in this introduction, it walks through the 4 essays that are in the book, in the second half of the book. So it's kind of interesting, like step-by-step examines these essays. Before you even get to the essays, you've already gotten the analysis of the essays. I'm not sure that's how I would have done it, but that's what we've got. And so today I want to focus on one of the 4 essays in this book, which is What is Metaphysics? And I'm going to jump back and forth between What is Metaphysics by Martin Heidegger and the explanation or examination of What is Metaphysics by the person who wrote the introduction, whose name is Werner Brock. So Brock's examination of the essay and the essay itself, I'll be kind of going back and forth between the two so that we can hopefully get a pretty good understanding of the essay, which is one of his more famous essays, What is Metaphysics? It's included in a lot of times when you'll get a collection of Heidegger's writings, like the Basic Writings of Martin Heidegger is a well-known Heidegger collection. That includes What is Metaphysics? It's one of his more well-known essays, and so that's what I want to deal with. I do want to come back to this book again for a second episode and deal with some other essays here, but today we'll just focus on What is Metaphysics. Martin Heidegger is notoriously difficult, so we'll see how we do with this. We'll see how we fare. I think having a little bit of help from the introduction is going to be beneficial to us. And I want to start reading from What is Metaphysics in the very beginning, and then I'll jump in the second section I read. I'm going to jump to the introduction. So here in the beginning of What is Metaphysics, he says, quote, "What is metaphysics? The question leads one to expect a discussion about metaphysics. Such is not our intention. Instead, we shall discuss a definite metaphysical question, thus, as it will appear, landing ourselves straight into metaphysics. Only in this way can we make it really possible for metaphysics to speak for itself. Our project begins with the presentation of a metaphysical question, then goes on to its development and ends with its answer. Seen from the point of view of sound common sense, philosophy, according to Hegel, is the world stood on its head. Hence the peculiar nature of our task calls for some preliminary definition. This arises out of the dual nature of metaphysical questioning. Firstly, every metaphysical question always covers the whole range of metaphysical problems. In every case, it is itself the whole. Secondly, every metaphysical question can only be put in such a way that the questioner, as such, is, by his very questioning, involved in the question. From this, we derive the following pointer. Metaphysical questioning has to be put as a whole, and has always to be based on the essential situation of existence, which puts the question. We question here and now on our own account. Our existence, a community of scientists, teachers, and students, is ruled by science. What essential things are happening to us in the foundations of our existence now that science has become our passion? The fields of science lie far apart. Their methodologies are fundamentally different. This disrupted multiplicity of disciplines is today only held together by the technical organization of the universities and their faculties, and maintained as a unit of meaning by the practical aims of these faculties. As against this, however, the root of the sciences in their essential ground has atrophied. And yet, insofar as we follow their most specific intentions, in all the sciences we are related to what is. Precisely from the point of view of the sciences, no field takes precedence over another, neither nature over history nor vice versa. No one methodology is superior to another. Mathematical knowledge is no stricter than philological or historical knowledge. It has merely the characteristic of exactness, which is not to be identified with strictness. To demand exactitude of history would be to offend against the idea of the kind of strictness that pertains to the humanistic sciences. The world relationship, which runs through all the sciences as such, constrains them to seek what is in itself, with a view to rendering it, according to its quiddity and its modality, an object of investigation and basic definition. What the sciences accomplish, ideally speaking, is an approximation to the essential nature of all things. This distinct world relationship to what is in itself is sustained and guided by a freely chosen attitude on the part of our human existence. It is true that the pre-scientific and extra-scientific activities of man also relate to what is, but the distinction of science lies in the fact that, in an altogether specific manner, it and it alone explicitly allows the object itself the first and last word. In this objectivity of questioning, definition, and proof, there is a certain limited submission to what is, so that this may reveal itself. This submissive attitude taken up by the scientific theory becomes the basis of a possibility, the basis of science acquiring a leadership of its own, albeit limited, in the whole field of human existence. The world relationship of science and the attitude of man responsible for it can, of course, only be understood when we see and understand what is going on in the world relationship so maintained. Man, one entity among others, pursues science. In this pursuit, what is happening is nothing less than the eruption of a particular entity called man into the whole of what is, in such a way that in and through this eruption, what is manifests itself, as and how it is. The manner in which the revelatory eruption occurs is the chief thing that helps what is to become what it is. This triple process of world relationship, attitude, and eruption, a radical unity, introduces something of the inspiring simplicity and intensity of Dasein into scientific existence. If we now explicitly take possession of scientific Dasein as clarified by us, we much necessarily say, that to which the world relationship refers is what is, and nothing else. That by which every attitude is molded is what is, and nothing more. That which scientific exposition affects its eruption is what is, and beyond that nothing. But is it not remarkable that precisely at that point where scientific man makes sure of his surest possession, he should speak of something else? What is to be investigated is what is and nothing more. Only what is and nothing more. Simply and solely what is, and beyond that nothing. But what about this nothing? Is it only an accident that we speak like that quite naturally? Is it only a manner of speaking and nothing more? But why worry about this nothing? Nothing is absolutely rejected by science and abandoned as null and void. But if we abandon nothing in this way, are we not by that act really admitting it? Can we, though, speak of an admission when we admit nothing? But perhaps this sort of cross-talk is already degenerating into an empty wrangling about words. Science, on the other hand, has to assert its soberness and seriousness afresh and declare that it is concerned solely with what is. Nothing. How can it be for science anything other than a horror and a phantasm? If science is right, then one thing stands firm. Science wishes to know nothing of nothing. Such is, after all, the strictly scientific approach to nothing. We know it by wishing to know nothing of nothing. Science wishes to know nothing of nothing. Even so, the fact remains that at the very point where science tries to put its own essence into words, it invokes the aid of nothing. It has recourse to the very thing it rejects. What sort of schizophrenia is this? A consideration of our momentary existence, as one ruled by science, has landed us in the thick of an argument. In the course of this argument, a question has already presented itself. The question only requires putting specifically. What about nothing? End quote. So there you see the introductory few pages of What is Metaphysics. And I should point out that What is Metaphysics was a lecture that Heidegger delivered. It was an address given by Heidegger upon his taking of the position of chair of philosophy of the University of Freiburg in 1929. So his teacher, Edmund Husserl, retired from that position, retired from teaching, and Heidegger took his place as chair of philosophy. And when he became chair of philosophy, he delivered that address. It wasn't part of a lecture course. It was just a single lecture, and it had to do with more than just trying to teach something. It's not just like I said, they're not students. He's not trying to teach anything, but he is trying to, it seems as though he's trying to open up the rest of the university faculty's eyes to metaphysical questions. And so that's why in his introduction, he kind of talks about the university a little bit. He talks about science. He talks about the various fields of study. He's trying to sort of unite them and point out the question that none of them seem to ask about nothingness. And he does it in an interesting way. He says basically that what science really is an examination of what is, that which exists, and nothing else. There's no other stuff that should be studied beyond what is. So it sets its boundary there. It says science is a study of what is and nothing else. But then he says, wait a minute, what do we mean when we say nothing else? What is this nothing? If science is the study of what is, why does it use nothing in its definition of itself as a sort of barrier? It is science and nothing else. It is existence and nothing. And he says, despite the fact that the sciences use nothing as a method of defining itself, science doesn't want to know anything about it. Science wants to know nothing of nothing. Science doesn't want to examine nothing or know anything about it. And he says that's where we begin. We will say, what about nothing? At the very end there, he says, a consideration of our momentary existence as one ruled by science has landed us in the thick of an argument. In the course of this argument, a question has already presented itself. The question only requires putting specifically, what about nothing? And this is sort of related to, of course, Heidegger's core project about being. What is being? What about being? What about being? What about nothing? What about what is? What about what isn't? And I think that it's an interesting and necessary component of the question of what is being and what is existence to understand how nothingness does form a conceptual component of being. Being implies not being. And as he gets into in this essay, we have to wonder whether not being could even be a thing without being. Does not being depend on being in the same way that being depends on not being? Do both being and not being come about from the same indeterminacy? And you'll remember the episode on the Heidegger book, Introduction to, or the Beginnings of Western Philosophy, I believe was the title. And where he talked about Anaximander, and that was the one where there was the three parts. The beginning was Anaximander. I believe the third part was, if I remember correctly, was about Parmenides. And the middle section was about no particular philosopher, but was about philosophy in general and was kind of a statement of Heidegger's core questions about beings, about existence, about why we should go back to the beginning of philosophy. That was a good book. But in it, when he talked about Anaximander, he talked about things coming into being from indeterminacy, falling back into indeterminacy, and that they sort of define themselves as things with definitions. And a definition is like a border of saying what something is and is not. If it's neither this nor that nor able to be said what it is, then it's in a state of indeterminacy, right? And then once you can say a thing exists, it exists by virtue of it not being other things, separating itself out from the indeterminacy. So in a sense, the thing, as becoming a thing, depends upon not being other things, depends upon the rest of existence not being that thing, and that thing being that thing. And in a way, you can see how there are three states almost. There's the indeterminacy, there's the being, and there's the not being. And the being and the not being spring forth out of the indeterminacy when they come to exist. So anyway, let me jump to the introduction here and the explanation, the exposition of this essay from Mr. Brock, Dr. Brock. He says, quote, "The problem chosen by Heidegger for the discussion of the nature of metaphysics is surprising and provocative indeed. And the first question which a thoughtful reader may well put to himself is, why did the author, whose main purpose it is at all times to reawaken a sense of the seriousness, utmost relevance, and urgency of the problem of being, discuss the apparently very odd, enigmatic, and unusual problem of nothingness as the representative problem selected for elucidating the question, what is metaphysics? When we speak of being, it is very rare that we bring the problem entailed really home to ourselves in thought. Being is not identical with any kind of being, such as that of a star or the earth or a plant or an animal or man. It is in all that is, and while we live amongst all that is, we think practically always of some kind of being or other, but rise hardly at all to the transcendent conception of being itself. In metaphysics, if there should be metaphysics, we go in thought beyond, i.e., transcend, the sphere not only of everyday life, but also of the objects of science and learning. Metaphysics is, in accordance with Hegel's saying in the Phenomenology of the Mind, which Heidegger quotes, from the standpoint of common sense, the world turned upside down. Heidegger suggests that the problem of nothingness, really understood, is intimately and inseparably connected with the problem of being, and actually that we rise to the problem of being only if we have faced the problem of nothingness. In discussing the problem of nothingness, he thus shows how rare it is that we truly meditate upon being." End quote. So that's not obviously a long section there, just a little bit kind of pointing out the oddness and the interestingness of the question and how the two are bound up together, how being and nothing are bound up together. And he says interestingly that we don't even really begin to question being or think about being until we have first considered nothingness. And I think this comes back to Heidegger's idea that real authenticity, real approach to the question of being comes about through existential angst or dread. There's a sort of negative feeling when we're faced with our own mortality, we're faced with the possibility of our own not being. We become faced with the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why do all these things exist? How is it that things are? How if you say, why is there something rather than nothing, have you not already embedded nothing into your question as a possibility? So when nothingness becomes a possibility, the question of being presents itself. So I think that's an interesting approach. I actually want to jump forward a little bit to another part, again, in the introduction, where he talks a little bit more about this essay to kind of help lay the foundation for what we'll be looking at and what this essay is all about in the big picture. He says, quote, "The totality of all that is can never be comprehended in its absolute sense. This, Heidegger admits, is impossible on principle. But in contrast to this impossibility stands the fact that we, as men, are placed amidst a great multitude of beings within the whole. This is indeed our fundamental position, which constantly repeats itself throughout life. And this being placed amidst beings within the whole, the state of mind of Dasein, as analyzed in Being and Time, opens up the realm of metaphysics. We are thus potentially face to face with metaphysics already in our actual Dasein, however little many of us may be aware of this fact. One term requires comment: within the whole. For without this, Heidegger's interpretation of how the nothing is genuinely encountered cannot be understood. The within the whole is, as it were, the pivot of Heidegger's subsequent argument and analysis. Many readers may be prepared to accept that man is placed amidst a great multitude of beings, but they may fail to see and refuse to acknowledge that this multitude of beings is met with within the whole. This is not an irrelevant or arbitrary addition, nor is it a product of abstract thought, but an expression of demonstrable experience. Heidegger himself refers to a unitariness of the whole experienced in everyday life, even if we are occupied with matters which attract our full attention so that we may think it is these matters alone that are there. No experience, be it of a landscape or of friends or of our own professional activity, is without this width of horizon, within which the special things or persons are met and activities performed, to which, from an early time onwards, the name of the world or the universe was attached, and which produces a familiar, though usually unnoticed, atmosphere of unitariness. The mood, as we know from earlier discussions, evoked in the individual, is the outcome of his being placed concretely amidst the variety of beings within the whole. And Heidegger refers explicitly to the mood of boredom to show that it is not aroused when something special is boring, but only when we are under the impact of the whole. In such a state of mind, everything, things, persons, and oneself, as it were, gather and are one in a mood, whereas usually the whole remains in the background and at the horizon of our experience. It is then that it gains fuller force and becomes prominent, and it is then that what is within the whole, as the author calls it, actually manifests itself in personal experience. Heidegger also draws the attention to another example very different from boredom: the joy aroused by the presence of the existence of a beloved person, in which he suggests being within the whole may likewise reveal itself. These examples are used to point to the great variety of moods in which what is within the whole can be genuinely experienced, but also to prepare, by way of contrast, for the altogether different and far more fundamental experience of nothingness. I feel that I should remark that, in my view, Heidegger has not made the meaning of the notion within the whole fully clear, and this is probably impossible to do in passing. A much more detailed phenomenological description would be required for this purpose. But the notion as such, it seems to me, is a genuine and very important one. Without it, transcending thought, such as the realization of nothingness or the visualization of being, would be impossible. And the implicit emphasis that the totality of things is not only incomprehensible, but not even experienced, yet that the things are experienced within something total, within the whole, in other words, that in being is the only approach to the whole open to us, seems to me most appropriate and formulated in a felicitous philosophic conception. End quote. So this section, he just brings up the concept of the whole, or everything, within the whole. So people, Dasein, are here in the world amongst things. We say in the world amongst things. We mean that the other things that we are with, the table, the other person, the microphone, the street, the sky, the clouds, the planet, the things are all here in the world. They're all here within the whole, all of the stuff. And you can't experience the whole. You can't experience everything. It's too multitudinous. It's impossible for us to really experience the whole. And yet, as a concept, we always know that everything is there, and we are in everything, and everything else is in everything. All of the beings, all of the entities, all of the objects are all sharing space within the whole. And being, as opposed to beings, as opposed to entities, being itself is a condition that applies to the whole. And through the whole, it applies to the entities. Because the entities are in the whole, are in the world, and the world is, therefore the things in the world are. The things in the world could not exist if they didn't have a world, if they didn't have a whole to exist in. And there's not a tremendous amount of that. He does say he thinks Heidegger doesn't give that enough time and effort in this essay, but he says it can't really be discussed properly in passing, but it's important to take note of. He says, the within the whole is, as it were, the pivot of Heidegger's subsequent argument and analysis. So an important point to keep in mind about everything in the world, that it's a crucial component of understanding being, and it's a crucial component of understanding existence. Anyhow, let's go back now to the essay. Let's go back to what is metaphysics a few pages later, where we get more of an examination of what is nothing. Here he says, quote, "What is nothing? Even the initial approach to this question shows us something out of the ordinary. So questioning, we postulate nothing as something that somehow or other is, as an entity. But it is nothing of the sort. The question as to the what and wherefore of nothing turns the thing questioned into its opposite. The question deprives itself of its own object. Accordingly, every answer to this question is impossible from the start, for it necessarily moves in the form that nothing is this, that, or the other. Question and answer are equally nonsensical in themselves where nothing is concerned. Hence, even the rejection by science is superfluous. The commonly cited basic rule of all thinking, the proposition that contradiction must be avoided, and common logic rule out the question. For thinking, which is essentially always thinking about something, would, in thinking of nothing, be forced to act against its own nature. Because we continually meet with failure as soon as we try to turn nothing into a subject, our enquiry into nothing is already at an end. Always assuming, of course, that in this enquiry logic is the highest court of appeal, that reason is the means and thinking the way to an original comprehension of nothing and its possible revelation. But it may be asked, can the law of logic be assailed? Is not reason indeed the master in this enquiry into nothing? It is in fact only with reason's help that we can define nothing in the first place and postulate it as a problem, though a problem that consumes only itself. For nothing is the negation of the totality of what is, that which is absolutely not. But at this point we bring nothing into the higher category of the negative, and therefore of what is negated. But according to the overriding and unassailable teachings of logic, negation is a specific act of reason. How then, in our inquiry into nothing, and into the very possibility of holding such an inquiry, can we dismiss reason? Yet is it so sure just what we are postulating? Does the not, the state of being negated, and hence negation itself, in fact represent that higher category under which nothing takes its place as a special kind of thing negated? Does nothing exist only because the not, i.e. negation, exist? Or is it the other way about? Does negation and the not exist only because nothing exists? This has not been decided. Indeed, it has not even been explicitly asked. We assert nothing is more original than the not and negation. If this thesis is correct, then the very possibility of negation as an act of reason, and consequently reason itself, are somehow dependent on nothing. How then can reason attempt to decide this issue? May not the apparent nonsensicality of the question and answer, where nothing is concerned, only rest, perhaps, on the blind obstinacy of the roving intellect? If, however, we refuse to be led astray by the formal impossibility of an enquiry into nothing, and still continue to inquire in the face of it, we must at least satisfy what remains the fundamental prerequisite for the full pursuit of any inquiry. If nothing, as such, is still to be inquired into, it follows that it must be given in advance. We must be able to encounter it. Where shall we seek nothing? Where shall we find nothing? In order to find something, must we not know beforehand that it is there? Indeed, we must. First and foremost, we can only look if we have presupposed the presence of a thing to be looked for. But here, the thing we are looking for is nothing. Is there, after all, a seeking without presupposition, a seeking complemented by a pure finding? However that may be, we do know nothing, if only as a term we bandy about every day. This ordinary hackneyed nothing, so completely taken for granted and rolling off our tongue so casually, we can even give an offhand definition of it. Nothing is the complete negation of the totality of what is. Does not this characteristic nothing point, after all, in the direction from which alone it may meet us? The totality of what is must be given beforehand, so as to succumb as such to the negation, from which nothing is then bound to emerge. But, even apart from the questionableness of this relationship between negation and nothing, how are we, as finite beings, to render the whole of what is, in its totality, accessible in itself, let alone to ourselves? We can, at a pinch, think of the whole of what is as an idea, and then negate what we have thus imagined in our thoughts and think it negated. In this way, we arrive at the formal concept of an imaginary nothing. But never nothing itself. But nothing is nothing, and between the imaginary and the authentic nothing, no difference can obtain if nothing represents complete lack of differentiation. But the authentic nothing, is this not once again that latent and nonsensical idea of a nothing that is? Once again, and for the last time, rational objections have tried to hold up our search, whose legitimacy can only be attested by a searching experience of nothing. As certainly as we shall never comprehend absolutely the totality of what is, it is equally certain that we find ourselves placed in the midst of what is, and that this is somehow revealed in totality. Ultimately, there is an essential difference between comprehending the totality of what is and finding ourselves in the midst of what is in totality. The former is absolutely impossible. The latter is going on in existence all the time. End quote. So what are we dealing with now? We're dealing with the question of nothing as a thing, because he starts off this section that I just read with a question, what is nothing? But if you say, what is nothing, you're presuming that nothing is something. To even use the word is about nothing, you're saying nothing is something, but nothing isn't something. It's nothing. And so logic begins to break down here. And he says thinking is about things. We think about things. We think about something. But we can't really think about nothing. That's forcing the mind to work against its own nature. And some sort of mental experience of nothing would probably not necessarily be a typical type of thinking, I would suspect. But he does say, is reason really the best approach and the best way to think about this? Are we really going to try to be logical? He says that here is where he brings up the negation. He says, the commonly cited basic rule of all thinking, the proposition that contradiction must be avoided. Itself, that concept that contradiction must be avoided is itself dependent on nothing. Because it depends on negation. It depends on saying no to something. He says nothing is the negation of the totality of what is. So the whole, everything, is negated in the concept of nothing. Nothing only exists as a negation of something, everything. True nothing is the negation of everything, the negation of what is. And here we've pulled nothing into and put it under the umbrella of negation. And he's got two things here that he says, it's kind of like which of these came first, the negation of a thing or nothingness. Does the negation of a thing depend on the concept of nothingness, or does the concept of nothingness depend on the negation of all that is? He says, does nothing exist only because the not, i.e. negation, exists, or is it the other way about? Does negation and the not exist only because nothing exists? He says, this has not been decided and it hasn't even been asked yet. But he says that nothing is more original than the not and negation. So he puts forward an answer to this question. Basically says that nothing is more primal, more primordial, more original than the negation. Which means that reason and negation are dependent on nothing. In that case, how can reason decide the issue when reason itself is dependent on the existence of nothing? And he says there's two ways of approaching nothing, because first of all, we can't know everything. We can't know the whole, the totality of everything, but we can imagine it. We can imagine all that is, the universe. But we can't experience it, we can't know it, we can just imagine it. And then we can negate what we have imagined and consider our new concept as nothing. But this is an imaginary nothing. It's a nothing that we've conceived in our minds as, like, what if there was nothing? What if nothing existed? But it's imaginary, it's not an authentic nothing. He says we can at a pinch think of the whole of what is as an idea and then negate what we have thus imagined in our thoughts and think it and negate it. In this way we arrive at the formal concept of an imaginary nothing, but never nothing itself. But he says, okay, well, what about the authentic nothing, not the imaginary nothing? An authentic nothing, wouldn't that sort of presuppose a nothing that is? And how can nothing exist? How can nothing be? For something to be, it must be a thing. Only a thing can be, and nothing is not a thing, and it can't be. And so, in a sense, there can be no authentic nothing. So let's jump forward a little bit, still remaining within the essay, where he begins to talk about angst and dread as means of approaching nothingness. He says, quote, at the very moment when our moods bring us face to face with what is in totality, they hide the nothing we are seeking. We are now less than ever of the opinion that mere negation of what is in totality, as revealed by these moods of ours, can in fact lead us to nothing. This could only happen in the first place in a mood so peculiarly revelatory in its import as to reveal nothing itself. Does there ever occur in human existence a mood of this kind, through which we are brought face to face with nothing itself? This may and actually does occur, albeit rather seldom and for moments only, in the key mood of dread or angst. By dread, we do not mean anxiety, which is common enough and is akin to nervousness, a mood that comes over us only too easily. Dread differs absolutely from fear. We are always afraid of this or that definite thing which threatens us in this or that definite way. Fear of is generally fear about something. Since fear has this characteristic limitation of and about, the man who is afraid, the nervous man, is always bound by the thing he is afraid of, or by the state in which he finds himself. In his efforts to save himself from this something, he becomes uncertain in relation to other things. In fact, he loses his bearings generally. In dread, no such confusion can occur. It would be truer to say that dread is pervaded by a peculiar kind of peace. And although dread is always dread of, it is not dread of this or that. Dread of is always a dreadful feeling about, but not about this or that. The indefiniteness of what we dread is not just lack of definition. It represents the essential impossibility of defining the what. The indefiniteness is brought out in an illustration familiar to everybody. In dread, we say one feels something uncanny. What is this something in this one? We are unable to say what gives one that uncanny feeling. One just feels it generally. All things, and we with them, sink into a sort of indifference, but not in the sense that everything simply disappears. Rather, in the very act of drawing away from us, everything turns toward us. This withdrawal of what is in totality, which then crowds round us in dread, this is what oppresses us. There is nothing to hold on to. The only thing that remains and overwhelms us whilst what is slips away is this nothing. Dread reveals nothing. In dread, we are in suspense. Or to put it more precisely, dread holds us in suspense because it makes what is in totality slip away from us. Hence, we too, as existence in the midst of what is, slip away from ourselves along with it. For this reason, it is not you or I that has the uncanny feeling, but one. In the trepidation of this suspense, where there is nothing to hold on to, pure Dasein is all that remains. Dread strikes us dumb. Because what is in totality slips away, and thus forces nothing to the fore, all affirmation fails in the face of it. The fact that when we are caught in the uncanniness of dread, we often try to break the empty silence by words spoken at random, only proves the presence of nothing. We ourselves confirm that dread reveals nothing when we have got over our dread. In the lucid vision which supervenes, while yet the experience is fresh in our memory, we must needs say that what we were afraid of was actually nothing. And indeed, nothing itself, nothing as such, was there. With this key mood of dread, therefore, we have reached that event in our Dasein which reveals nothing, and which must therefore be the starting point of our inquiry. What about nothing? End quote. So there we get a bit of his discussion of dread and how the sense of dread is not like being afraid of something. It's not a state of anxiety. It's not a fear of a thing. It's this peculiar mood when we're afraid of nothing, but we are sensing nothingness. And all that is, including ourselves, seems to slip away from us, seems distant from us, and the presence of nothing is felt. Nothingness is felt. And that's really what we're in a state of dread about. That's really what has revealed itself to us. And I think it's interesting how Heidegger makes so much of moods. Like the interpreter, Brock, talked about Heidegger's writings about boredom. And that's in a different essay, but he talks about various moods. I think in Being in Time, he spent some time talking about moods. And this isn't exactly like reason and rationality. This is not an argument. This is not a series of logical points built upon one another to prove a thesis. This is drawing our attention to a certain state of mind that we, from time to time, enter into, in which some phenomena is experienced. And the experience of the phenomena points us towards something, some aspect of the world, that we can't necessarily get just through a logical sequence. And that's a different sort of philosophy, I think. It's a different sort of way of approaching philosophy and a way of approaching the world that brings experience to the fore. And Heidegger is a student of Husserl, and he's a student of phenomenology. And so the things we experience, the phenomena that we experience, sort of take center stage for Heidegger. They become the means by which we can understand existence, what we experience. And this certainly points us back at least a little bit to pragmatism and William James and his theories about experience. It was only a few episodes ago that we talked about the experience of activity, how we experience things happening. William James is on a similar sort of mindset of exploring philosophy and exploring reality through an analysis of our experiences. So in a way, William James is almost a phenomenologist. I think pragmatism is related to phenomenology. So let's get to the next section where I'm going to jump back at this point, back to the interpretation. And he talks a little bit here about nothing and the fact of nothing being or not being as a thing, interpreting nothingness as something, which is a question that, or a concept that plagues the whole idea of nothingness. How can we talk about nothingness as a thing? If nothing exists, then it's a thing that exists, and it's no longer nothing, no thing, right? It's no longer no thing if it's a thing. It can't be a thing and not a thing. So that's a strange sort of logical question mark that pops up in the discussions of nothing. So here he says, quote, "Whatever the nature and functions of nothingness may be, the phenomenon of nothingness is discussed as if it were something like a thing, something quasi-objective, though avowedly it is stated at once that it is not anything that is, and that it is not an object. But dread, if I understand the subsequent exposition rightly, may now be likened in some way to a sense perception, which makes it possible for us to perceive an object, or to the mind when it meditates upon being, and the emphasis lies here on that which is comparable to the object or to being, i.e. on nothingness. If I may exaggerate for a moment, dread is here nothing more than what makes nothingness accessible. But again, Heidegger quite rightly states dread is not an apprehending of nothingness. In other words, from now onward, Heidegger actually treats nothingness as a metaphysical phenomenon, as a strange and bewildering but very important kind of entity, as if the term entity be used for a moment inappropriately and metaphorically. Were he not to do so, he would not be dealing with a metaphysical problem. Nothingness belongs to what we commonly call the ultimate reality of things. It is not just a matter of human thought or of a special kind of feelings or emotions which makes things look different from what they actually are. As in Being and Time and in The Essence of Truth, Heidegger attempts to overcome here if, as I say, I understand him rightly, the anthropological and subjective approach to philosophical problems, favored and even predominant in philosophy since Locke, Hume, and Kant. The thought in this section is very original and most daring, and my task can only be to help, if possible, a little in the understanding of it. What then is the phenomenon of nothingness, as visualized by Heidegger? Nothingness is encountered in the state of dread, not as something isolated apart from the things in the world, but as one with them. The first essential trait emphasized is that, in the state of dread, things seem to slide away, sink away, that the control over things strangely loosens and weakens. This is taken to be a functioning of the nothing. It is one with the things in the world, yet, owing to its functioning, the things somehow change. The second essential trait is described as a withdrawal, a retreat from the things, but so that eyes and thought, as it were, still spellbound, rest on them. This indicates more the effect upon man, but is likewise thought to be an attitude enforced by the nothing. This trait is characterized in somewhat more detail. The nothing is said essentially not to attract, but to repel, thereby bringing about the withdrawal or the retreat on the part of the individual. But while the repelling force is thought to emanate from the nothing, experienced in the state of dread, the attention of the individual is drawn and fixed to the things in the world as they slide away and sink. It is as if the nothing, in repelling the individual, was pointing to them, inducing him to get proper hold of them, impossible as this is in the very state of dread. Heidegger concludes, it is the nature, the essence of nothingness, to press through dread upon the Dasein of the individual in the described way by repelling and enforcing a withdrawal, by making the things in the world slide away out of reach, and yet by directing and fixing the attention of the powerless man on them. It is not merely the feelings of the individual that are aroused. This would be a misleading understatement. The whole of his Dasein, i.e. his actual relationship with the things and the persons around him as they are, and even with himself, is profoundly affected. This, Heidegger calls, the nothing is at work. The nothing is functioning. Coining for it the new terms, Nichten and Nichtung, as it were literally to nothing and the nothinging. This is the first step in the exposition of the phenomena of nothingness. End quote. So that's kind of maybe a little challenging to wrap your head around what is said there. But he's talking about how Heidegger talks about dread and nothingness and how we can understand nothingness operating, so to speak. In that as we begin to encounter nothingness in a state of dread, what we really experience is the sinking away or the retreat of the things. The things seem distant from us. We seem distant from ourselves. But our attention is still drawn to the things as they retreat. Our attention isn't drawn specifically to nothing. We feel a sense of dread because we feel our connection to things slipping away. We feel a question in our mind of, what is this? How is this? How am I here? How has, like there's a division. How has this come about that I am here? And my connection to here, my connection to the world, suddenly feels tenuous, feels fragile. Feels like, it's almost like a strange slipping into madness when you experience the sense of dread. Because there's a disconnection from all things. Right? So you're not afraid of anything, you're not specific. It's like this anxiety, and I know Heidegger says it's not exactly anxiety, but let's say it's like anxiety. It's a discontent that comes about when we feel that things are slipping away from us and that we don't know what will happen next. And so nothingness makes itself known not by intruding itself into our minds, but by pulling all things away from us. It's like the ruination and the destruction of our connection to the things in the world. So it sort of repels things, it diminishes things, everything sinks into nothingness. Nothingness doesn't jump up at us, but instead erodes the things. And we're not left with nothingness as a thing, but we're left with the lack of the things, the loss of the things in our world. So let's waltz back to the original essay once again. Now we will look at nothing again, of course, and how fundamental it is to reality, where he says, quote, "As far as we are concerned, and indeed generally speaking, nothing is always distorted out of its original state. By what? By the fact that in one way or another we completely lose ourselves in what is. The more we turn to what is in our dealings, the less we allow it to slip away, and the more we turn aside from nothing. But all the more certainly do we thrust ourselves into the open superficies of existence. And yet this perpetual, if ambiguous, aversion from nothing accords, within certain limits, with the essential meaning of nothing. It, nothing in the sense of nihilation, relegates us to what is. Nothing annihilates unceasingly, without our really knowing what is happening, at least not with our everyday knowledge. What could provide more telling evidence of the perpetual, far-reaching, and yet ever dissimulated overtness of nothing in our existence than negation? This is supposed to belong to the very nature of human thought, but negation cannot by any stretch of imagination produce the not out of itself as a means of distinguishing and contrasting given things, thrusting this not between them, as it were. How, indeed, could negation produce the not out of itself, seeing that it can only negate when something is there to be negated? But how can a thing that is or ought to be negated be seen as something negative unless all thinking as such is on the lookout for the not? But the not can only manifest itself when its source, the annihilation of nothing, and hence nothing itself, is drawn out of concealment. The not does not come into being through negation, but negation is based on the not, which derives from the annihilation of nothing. Nor is negation only a mode of annihilating behavior, i.e. behavior based a priori on the annihilation of nothing. Herewith we have proved the above thesis in all essentials. Nothing is the source of negation, not the other way about. If this breaks the sovereignty of reason in the field of enquiry into nothing in being, then the fate of the rule of logic and philosophy is also decided. The very idea of logic disintegrates in the vortex of a more original questioning. However often and however variously negation, whether explicit or not, permeates all thinking, it cannot of itself be a completely valid witness to the manifestation of nothing as an essential part of Dasein, for negation cannot be cited either as the sole or even the chief mode of annihilation, with which, because of the annihilation of nothing, Dasein is saturated. More abysmal than the mere propriety of rational negation is the harshness of opposition and the violence of loathing. More responsible, the pain of refusal and the mercilessness of an interdict. More oppressive, the bitterness of renunciation. These possible modes of annihilating behavior, though, which our Dasein endures, even if it does not master. The facts of our being thrown upon the world are not modes of negation merely. That does not prevent them from expressing themselves in and through negation. Indeed, it is only then that the empty expanse of negation is really revealed. The permeation of Dasein by annihilating modes of behavior points to the perpetual, ever-dissimulated manifestness of nothing, which only dread reveals in all its originality. Here, of course, we have the reason why original dread is generally repressed in Dasein. Dread is there, but sleeping. All Dasein quivers with its breathing. The pulsation is slightest in beings that are timorous, and is imperceptible in the yea, yea, and nay, nay of busy people. It is readiest in the reserved, and surest of all in the courageous. But this last pulsation only occurs for the sake of that for which it expends itself, and so as to safeguard the supreme greatness of Dasein. End quote. What the heck does that mean? Well, one thing that I would say is that he is reaffirming that nothingness is more primordial than negation, and although I'm not sure I can clearly restate or summarize his means of getting there, it does seem a little bit intuitive that the concept of not is prerequisite for the concept of negation. It is not what is. Like there is all that is, and then there is not what is. There is no thing depends on the concept of not, right? The negation. But the negation depends on the concept of nothingness, right? How can it be, right? There's the book, and then there's not the book. There's all the things that are not the book. Then there's like the world in which the book does not exist. The negation can't even be stated absent some seed of nothingness being present in the language, in the thoughts. I mean, it seems to me, in a way, they're kind of just bound up together, but he does assert that essentially, and let's see if I can really grab this. He says, negation cannot by any stretch of imagination produce the not out of itself as a means of distinguishing and contrasting given things. thrusting the not between them, as it were. How could negation produce the not out of itself, seeing that it can only negate when something is there to be negated? He says, how can a thing that is or ought to be negated be seen as something negative unless all thinking as such is on the lookout for the not? But the not can only manifest itself when its source, the nihilation of nothing, and hence nothing itself, is drawn out of concealment. The not does not come into being through negation, but negation is based on the not, which derives from the nihilation of nothing. He says, herewith we've proved the above thesis that nothing is the source of negation and not the other way about. And he says, this is the interesting part. He says, if this breaks the sovereignty of reason in the field of inquiry into nothing and being, then the fate of the rule of logic in philosophy is also decided. The very idea of logic disintegrates in the vortex of a more original questioning. If reason depends on negation coming before nothing, but the thesis and the proof of the thesis that nothing is the source of negation, if that breaks logic, then so be it, logic is broken. He says negation cannot be cited as the sole or even chief mode of nihilation because Dasein is saturated with nihilation. The harshness of opposition, the violence of loathing, the pain of refusal, the mercilessness of an interdict, the bitterness of renunciation. In all of our activities outside of logic, we remain shot through with various forms of nihilation, various forms of nothing, various components of nothing in our activities, in our thoughts, in our modes of being. He says, the original dread is generally repressed in Dasein. Dread is there, but it's sleeping. All Dasein quivers with its breathing. It's always present. It's present least in the timid, but it's present most in the courageous. So anyhow, let's jump back for a minute to the explanation where he says, quote, those who hold the view that negation, as applied in rational thought, is the source of all forms of not, may find it interesting to see the reference to other specific ways of behavior met in actual life, such as opposition to others or the loathing of their actions, refusal or interdict or renunciation. In all of them, according to Heidegger's interpretation, nothingness is functioning in one way or another, though not so purely and genuinely as in the experience of dread. Outspoken negation in the form of words may be added to all of them, but it is not required by these ways of behavior as such. This reference to ways of behavior, other than the experience of dread and rational negation, seems to me, apart from the analysis of dread and of nothingness itself, the weightiest argument advanced by Heidegger in support of the view that nothingness is primarily encountered somewhere in life itself and not in logical thought. If I see the problem rightly, critics would have to analyze ways of behavior, such as the examples mentioned, showing that no negative force, Heidegger would say no functioning of nothingness, is at work in them, which it seems to be would be difficult to assert and to demonstrate, or that negation, as applied in rational and logical thought, is a phenomena so much of its own that the other forms of nothingness, as experienced in the state of dread or as manifest in specific ways of behavior, are not only of a fundamentally different type, a line of reasoning which may well be taken up and is, I think, implicitly admitted by Heidegger, but that negation shows no resemblance to them whatever and is not dependent on them. A problem of a very interesting kind has thus been posed by Heidegger's analysis. End quote. So again, a brief little section there, but referring to the part of the essay I just read where he brings up these other modes of being, these other types of behavior that are infused with annihilating nothingness. And he says, first of all, this is a pretty interesting question and an interesting approach. He says that it's Heidegger's strongest argument. He says this reference to ways of behavior, other than dread and rational negation. Right? Negation is a component of logic. Something is or is not is a statement of truth about things. And it's dependent on reason. You reason a thing to be true or false, either is or is not. But he says that this is the weightiest argument advanced by Heidegger in support of the view that nothingness is primarily encountered somewhere in life itself and not in logical thought. Right? Logical thought can lead us to negation, or it deploys negation, and we can look at the negation deployed in logic. But nothingness is all throughout our ways of being and our life and our various types of activities. And it's not a question that lives solely or even primarily in the realm of logic. So let's look at the conclusion here. We're going to go back to what is metaphysics. Not the absolute end of the essay, but the last part that I want to look at here, where he says, quote, "Science can only come to terms with itself when it does not abandon nothing. The alleged soberness and superiority of science becomes ridiculous if it fails to take nothing seriously. Only because nothing is obvious can science turn what is into an object of investigation. Only when science proceeds from metaphysics can it conquer its essential task ever afresh, which consists not in the accumulation and classification of knowledge, but in the perpetual discovery of the whole realm of truth, whether of nature or of history. Only because nothing is revealed in the very basis of our Dasein is it possible for the utter strangeness of what is to dawn on us. Only when the strangeness of what is forces itself upon us does it awaken and invite our wonder. Only because of wonder, that is to say, the revelation of nothing, does the why spring to our lips. Only because this why is possible can we seek for reasons and proofs in a definite way. Only because we can ask and prove are we fated to become inquirers in this life. The enquiry into nothing puts us, the inquirers, ourselves in question. It is a metaphysical one. Man's Dasein can only relate to what is by projecting into nothing. Going beyond what is of the essence of Dasein, but this going forward is metaphysics itself. That is why metaphysics belongs to the nature of man. It is neither a department of scholastic philosophy nor a field of chance ideas. Metaphysics is the ground phenomenon of Dasein. It is Dasein itself. Because the truth of metaphysics is so unfathomable, there is always the lurking danger of profoundest error. Hence, no scientific discipline can hope to equal the seriousness of metaphysics. Philosophy can never be measured with the yardstick of the idea of science. Once the question we have developed as to the nature of nothing is really asked by and among our own selves, then we are not bringing in metaphysics from the outside. Nor are we simply transporting ourselves into it. It is completely out of our power to transport ourselves into metaphysics because, insofar as we exist, we are already there. While man exists, there will be philosophizing of some sort. Philosophy, as we call it, is the setting in motion of metaphysics, and in metaphysics, philosophy comes to itself and sets about its explicit tasks. Philosophy is only set in motion by leaping with all its being, as only it can, into the ground possibilities of being as a whole. For this leap, the following things are of crucial importance. Firstly, leaving room for what is in totality. Secondly, letting oneself go into nothing. That is to say, freeing oneself from the idols we all have, into which we are wont to go cringing. Lastly, letting this suspense range where it will, so that it may continually swing back again to the ground question of metaphysics, which is wrested from nothing itself. Why is there any being at all? Why not, far rather, nothing? End quote. So there he's bringing everything back to this fundamental question. He says science can only come to terms with itself when it does not abandon nothing. And he walks through an interesting series here. He says, only because nothing is revealed in the very basis of our Dasein is it possible for the utter strangeness of what is to dawn on us. we can only really contemplate what is and the strangeness of what is, the uniqueness and uncanniness of existence, of the things that are, when we accept nothingness into our thought process, when nothing is revealed in the very basis of our Dasein. And only when that strangeness forces itself upon us do we begin to feel a sense of wonder and amazement at all that is, at existence. Do we begin to think about existence as a peculiar phenomenon? And only when we feel this sense of wonder do we begin to say why. And only when why is possible, only because this why is possible as such, can we begin to seek for reasons and proofs, and only then do we become inquirers. Only then do we become scientists. When we begin to say why, when we begin to feel a sense of wonder, and we begin to think about the strangeness, and because we have thought about, or we have exposed ourselves to nothingness. And the other thing I think is, important at the very end, he says it's by beginning to think about nothing and by allowing nothingness into our questions and into our philosophy, do we begin to ask the most fundamental, he says, the ground question of metaphysics. Why is there any being at all? Why not far rather nothing? Why is there something rather than nothing? What about being? Why is being? That question must be attached to a perception of nothingness. So that's all super interesting, I think. Thanks a lot for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.